Director of Research here at the Center for Bioethics and Humanities. Our center is in the process of building what we hope someday to be the most research-intensive empirical bioethics unit and group in the country. And part of that involves hiring new faculty. And we have a candidate who's here today to talk to us, Dr. Nicole Martinez Martin here, who is here. Dr. Martin has attended every single Ivy League university in the country. She got a undergrad from Princeton. She got a JD from Harvard. She got her PhD from the University of Chicago in comparative human development, where her doctoral work focused on the use of neuroscience and technologies in the courts. She's currently a postdoc fellow at Stanford. And I'm glad that she didn't go to that school with a Y because I refuse to mention their name. All right, for the Yaleys here, then sorry. Her research interests involve ethical issues related to mental health, digital health technology, artificial intelligence. She also received a grant from the Greenwald Foundation. But the greatest thing I've learned a lot about Nicole, but the best thing I learned about her today was the fact, let me ask you a question. How many people in this room have ever been an author on a paper in Nature? One. Oh, Larry. How many have ever been a first or last author on a paper in Nature? Yeah, well, all right. Sad, boo. Nicole has a paper out today in Nature in which she's the first author, entitled Data Mining for Health, Staking Out the Ethical Territory of Digital Phenotyping. Why I like this is, for those of you in our field, you know, those papers are a once or a twice in a lifetime achievement, and they are amazing. The best part about it is her paper came out today and she didn't tell anyone it was coming out, and that is awesome. Thank you for coming, Nicole. Take it away.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for having me here. I'm very excited to be here. And so today I will be talking about the work, part of which is actually in that paper, and then also about a study that I've started with a research team, a DELPHI study that is sort of moving that work forward about digital phenotyping. As Eric very kindly said, I have a background in law and human development. That's led me to be interested in research of the ethics into different aspects of behavior and mental health, particularly how technologies are brought to bear in order to address mental health issues. So today's talk, I'm going to start by giving an overview of the technology that I've been looking at, identify some of the ethical challenges, and then go into just some of the work emerging from the DELPHI panel that I've been working on. Just to kind of set the background for mental health. Mental health disorders exert a considerable burden on individuals and society. It's estimated that 1 in 5 people have a diagnosable mental illness. In the US, 1 in 20 have a severe mental illness that affects their everyday functioning. And it's also estimated that about 55% of people do not receive treatment. And this is for a variety of reasons, lack of therapists, costs, as well as, some issues, that remain problems in terms of providing, adequate diagnosis and treatment for mental health disorders. If you want to put it in cost terms, the cost of mental health burdens are estimated at $201 billion per year for anxiety and depression alone. But of course, for people experiencing mental illness, there are many facets, including stigma, for the burden that they experience. And so, as digital technology has advanced, there have been these efforts to bring digital technology to help improve the measurement of cognition and mood, improve diagnostics, and also improve delivery of treatment. And as a sort of background, that, there's an evolving ecosystem of mental health research, that, that more and more, an increasing proportion of mental health technology research is being done in the private sector, and this represents the sort of increasing investment that you have there, with about 150 sort of $1 million now being put in by companies into mental health technology. And in general, digital health is a huge area of investment in the private sector, but this also sort of brings about some of the facets of the ethical challenges that I'll bring up, because in bringing this technology to bear, there are a number of questions about, with private companies, how they monetize this this investment, often through the collection of our data. And so what I'll be talking about today is the specific technology. I'll be using the term digital phenotyping, but there are, it's an emerging technology, and so there are a number of different terms that people use for it. And the idea is that it really comes with the sort of advent of so many people, the ubiquity of smartphones, and them being used as a tool for collecting and monitoring data about people, and how that might be combined often with machine learning techniques in order to analyze that data and come up with ways to measure and also provide recommendations regarding mental health. So this was an article, one of the first articles to use the term digital phenotype. It's from Nature Biotech in 2015. And it's really hoped that this ability to sort of collect the data from smartphones will really help improve mental health care. One of the areas that has stymied researchers in mental health are the problems of just sort of how you gather data, how you measure that data in ways that are meaningful for understanding mental health conditions. And so what they might do is collect information from the smartphone, and some of this, as it says in the last box, might be digital exhaust, which is what many of you might think of, the types of things you type into social media, where they collect that, sort of look at what is said, but also, a number of things that, activity, where you're located, how you tap on the phone, what are the sort of reaction times, how they can be translated into indicators of attention and memory. And so so the voice prosody, the rise and fall of your voice, all of these are data that the smartphone can collect. And then once it's analyzed, it's used to come up with what they call a digital phenotype, or a way of sort of identifying behavior, mood, or cognition that may be of use in order to decide what kind of treatment someone might need, or what kind of diagnosis that they might have. And currently, the way that these data are being used is it's being measured against DSM categories of mental illness. So, what you might be used to as these sort of categories of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and different indicators of, mania. But as moving forward, they're looking that they might actually be creating kind of new risk assessment, or new risk fields to identify, more specifically things that may be of interest. And so some of the interest in digital phenotyping comes from these studies. I've listed up here, for example, psychosis, that they were able to use vocal prosody, in order to identify a risk of a psychotic episode within, sort of a month's time. And there have also been indicators, again, sometimes using the vocal prosody, sometimes using reaction times when tapping the phone, to look at indicators of depression, trajectory of Parkinson's disease, or even dementia. And these are just some of the types of behavioral, mood, cognition disorders that they're looking to measure with digital phenotyping. And so, these bring up, and I'll talk more about these ethical issues shortly when I talk about the study, But, a number of these are, the kind of list that you would think of as ethical issues: the safety and accuracy, privacy, accountability, informed consent. So I'm going to take a moment just to, next just bring up what are some of the features of digital phenotyping that present more challenges when it comes to the ethics of using it and making sure that people receive the benefits. So I have up here about a paradigm shift, and so like a number of kind of trends that have to do with digital technology in healthcare. The traditional way of looking at ethical obligations and are within a sort of idea that health information is primarily under the control of healthcare institutions and physicians primarily, and that it arises in this dyadic physician-patient relationship. And that's been a sort of traditional notion that has been underlying many of the ways that ethical obligations are conceived of and acted upon in our healthcare landscape. And so what the paradigm shift here involves is that for example that health information and the protection of health information is often seen as the sort of domain of healthcare, with this kind of clear idea of, okay, it's health information, because you know that it's giving an indicator of your your physical health or otherwise. And so this presents some challenges because it's taking information that initially isn't, starting off as health information that people may regard as just sort of mundane, tapping on the phone or talking on the phone, and it becomes health information, arguably health information, depending on, the domain. And in that way, it can challenge some of the traditional frameworks for protecting health information. So for example, the HIPAA, which identifies health information, protects health information that comes up under health institutions, that when you have digital phenotyping that may be used outside of the care of a clinician, that might be used for things other than healthcare, and yet still reveal information about someone's behavioral health, it can challenge some of those traditional frameworks for it. Also, because digital phenotyping, that often the often the algorithms that are used for digital phenotyping are generated through machine learning. There come up questions that come up under data ethics. For example, whether the information used in order to generate these algorithms, whether there was something with the population being used or something about the data that might have unknowingly introduced bias. So an example of this from another domain was the COMPASS algorithm that is used for criminal justice sentencing, that it was found that because it was using past data about sort of recidivism in the criminal justice system, and as I hope many of you are aware, there's a lot of bias against, for example, African Americans in the criminal justice system, that the use of that data actually, in a lot of ways, just simply kind of replicated that bias in this other form, instead of sort of accounting for it or being able to deal with it. And then also because that algorithm, both because it was proprietary, but also what can come up in AI is a difficulty in examining the sort of reasons behind the generation of certain algorithms. People couldn't then examine it in order to sort of better understand and address the discrimination. And then as a sort of another note is that, as I said, the digital phenotyping information is really at the end of the day often used as a sort of risk assessment. And as it comes up with, sort of new measurements of behavior, new ways of categorizing or identifying risk assessment, there can be, there can be implications then for the type of stigma or the type of things that are then done with those risk assessments. For example, risk of violent behavior. And as a note about the regulatory environment, so for much of of digital phenotyping that's used for healthcare purposes, most of it would fall under the definition of a medical device, and thus be subject to FDA regulation. But the FDA has really been finding some challenges in regulating this profusion of digital health technology. Some of it is just the sheer amount, just thousands of sort of new types of health technology coming out. And they sometimes, even though they technically have domain over assessing them, they sort of decline. They use their discretion to decline assessing them. But also, there are certain challenges with regulating devices that use the machine learning. As I said, some of the reasoning behind the decision making, is not necessarily accessible for, third parties to be able to look at, and that can present certain challenges then for assessing those devices. The FDA has, really been sort of moving forward, trying its best to sort of to deal with these issues. One way that it does it is through a pre-certification program where, certain companies are found to be sort of sufficiently, have a strong enough track record, have what they call a culture of excellence, and then, their devices might be sort of fast-tracked through, but that even though that is in some ways a useful way of addressing this, it can still leave question marks regarding, sort of individual devices and their uses. Privacy, in terms of regulating privacy, HIPAA, is a main way of regulating privacy in the healthcare domain. But as I said, you also then have these issues of how that privacy might be meaningfully addressed, and should it be addressed through regulation for other uses that are outside of healthcare, such as direct-to-consumer applications. And then finally, there's, in terms of regulatory environment, there have been these questions about advancing regulations that might help affirm consumer rights in these areas. Europe has the General Data Protection Act that was just passed, and that gives consumers a lot more ability to opt out of having their data used downstream for different purposes. Their consent is considered just for the particular use of that data, and they also just give them more ability to sort of know what their data might be used for. At the moment, there's not similar regulation in the United States, but California did pass a bill with some similar consumer acts, California Consumer Right to Privacy. So that's the kind of regulatory context that these devices are in. And a number of these ethical issues really have some differences in, how to sort of see what ethical challenges might be more pressing, depending on the domain that they're in. So, clinical and research for improving treatment and diagnosis, that, I've already discussed some of those aspects. But for example, with research, one question that comes is being addressed more, for example, in Camille Nebeker's work, is whether IRBs actually understand enough about what these kinds of devices collect, what kind of risks are presented to subjects through this. As I said, these are a number of different uses. As I said, law, it could be used for criminal justice or custody. Employment, these types of behavioral assessments might be used to determine, for example, when you go to a page, what job openings even are opened up. When you look at an employment site, they might be used to automate applicant screening, or they might be used for wellness programs by employers, which have a kind of so far a murky history about how sometimes that health information may get used in ways that don't benefit the employee. So also on this list are financial, higher education, or insurance. And I'll give a couple examples of not directly digital phenotyping, but a sort of associated practices. So as you can imagine, universities have been very interested in this kind of technology. For one thing they're interested in is screening for depression or suicide risk. Another thing, and this came up with Arizona, is that even the information that you get from your ID key cards. So what Arizona was doing, and it was without informing the students that they were doing this, was they were gathering that data, and one of the faculty there used it in order to come up with an algorithm to assess dropout risk. And when students found out about it, they were very upset about this, this use without their permission. And then what this also brings up, and this would bring it up if it, was used for depression or suicide risk as well as dropout risk, is, this question of then, first of all, who okayed this? What are the risks of, sort of negative negative results and how that impacts people. But again, what decisions then at that institution are going to flow from this? Often universities, when it comes to depression or suicide risk, have a more kind of risk management approach where they just try and kind of get that person out. With this, the hope was to, connect people with services that might help avoid the dropout situation. But you could also see an unfortunate situation where maybe it might have been used in some ways to kind of, again, get people out the door. And these are things that, as these kinds of tools are used, really need to be thought of, is that, within the institution, what kind of decisions are going into then how it's being used, how people might be protected from, sort of negative risks from how they're being used. And this actually comes from insurance. This graphic comes from actually insurance companies using this information. So for example, a number of financial institutions, they're actually allowed to track things like your taps and sort of ways that you use your screen. And the idea is they're allowed to use it as a way of addressing security concerns. But it's come out that they've actually, behind the scenes, sometimes they're able to use that information for behavioral behavioral assessment. So Royal Bank of Scotland is one of the only ones that is actually admitted to doing this. But what they're able to do with that information is, for example, they actually were able to identify what they think are people who may be at risk of Parkinson's or dementia. And more and more the question is then whether these can then end up having repercussions for people with things like, if that data gets sold in some way, can that be used then for changing people's insurance rates, things of that nature. And New York Times last week came out, again, a sort of warning of your apps, so many of them are collecting this kind of data like location data, and people aren't necessarily aware of that, and some people may be rather uncomfortable with the kinds of things that it reveals about them. And so, let's see, at my institution, we actually were approached by a company that is doing digital phenotyping, and they were interested in coming up with or looking at recommendations for digital phenotyping applications for mental health. Digital phenotyping, I should say, can be used for other things than just mental health, but because of the great need for measurement in mental health and because of the ease already of collecting the kind of data that can be used for mental health purposes, that's been a primary application so far. So we received a grant from Greenwall in order to look into this, and so we're doing a DELPHI study. The research team is myself, Mildred Cho, and Hank Greeley. Do research ethics law at Stanford, and then Tom Insel, who he used to be director of NIMH, but now he's actually has a company that does digital phenotyping, and so that was part of his interest in having a collaboration to address this. And so the idea of a DELPHI study is that you are looking to involve experts and find areas of consensus that where they think that these recommendations, these guidelines will be useful in addressing the ethical dimensions of digital phenotyping. We have 25 panelists. They're anonymous, for these purposes, but we chose people from a variety of areas of expertise: machine learning, people who are developing digital phenotyping type apps, computer science, clinicians. I have patients here, but really it's people with lived experience, and also people with expertise in law and ethics. And so we have different stages for this. What we're just finishing up right now are interviews with the experts. These are semi-structured interviews in order to just gather initial information on their perspectives on ethical, legal, social implications of digital phenotyping. After this, we're going to have 2 rounds of surveys where we provide, sort of areas of consensus, areas of ethical interest, and they'll be able to provide feedback on it. And then we'll also have a web-based conference in the end to, help produce areas of recommendation for addressing, what are the priorities in addressing the ethical issues, and what might be some suggestions or recommendations for how this might be, conceptualized. Unsurprisingly, privacy has been pretty much everyone's idea of a priority in this. Again, it's because of, the particular way that the data is generated in contexts that people may not associate with healthcare. And so, this goes along with informed consent, that, you have these issues of adequately informing people of privacy risks, but also what people might not be aware of, and this is, has come from the sort of expert opinion, is that, these data sources that individually, people may be concerned or may not have concerns individually, but when they're in combination, again, they may produce behavioral information that people are not expecting, to sort of be out there. Again, depending on the domain, especially when it's outside of having oversight, by a clinician, or research area, there just may not be those regulations at the moment to protect that data. There's also, comes up the use of electronic health records, how this information may be in electronic health records, even when used by a clinician, and thus accessible to, for example, if someone gives consent for, employer or other clinicians to have access to their electronic health record, again, they may not be aware of the implications, the privacy implications of that. And so this is one of the sort of big areas that we're grappling with. One of the main recommendations is often transparency, including this in informed consent. But this is a question of whether that is sufficient for some people's purpose, whether there's just too much potential for misuse in certain contexts, in which case there may be a need for considering where regulation might be best applied. So again, with the data ethics issues, there's discussion in terms of addressing possible areas of bias, or possible sort of implications of some of the use of their data, are sort of bringing out the sort of ethics of use of data, which involves attention to the curation of the data, how that data is prepared, who it's coming from for the particular applications that it's being used in, whether that data is being used appropriately in order to address potential bias, and to consider what kind of core values may need to be or that need to be followed, transparency, and I'll get to actually transparency in a moment, accountability in terms of what kinds of areas, as I said, even within the physician-patient relationship, there can be questions in terms of traditionally with physician judgment, it's considered that the physician is the one who is ultimately liable for any issues that come up with the physician judgment. But here, the question is that are there ways that the tool can ultimately be thought of as a third party where there may be other liability concerns involved, where, there may be a need to sort of question liability of developers or different ways that the institutions use these particular tools. And then also, in terms of talking about how you incorporate values in design, a sort of big question that comes up is how even in the design of these tools to think of the potential for incidental findings, as they understand more, are there ways that, if, for example, if suicide risk comes up, are there ways that, certain tools of this should always incorporate, that kind of behavioral measurement, with the other question being then, if it does come up, who are the obligations in terms of reporting it and when to report it? So these are the types of, questions that come up. For transparency, many of the experts are in agreement that often the answer is, as this person describes it, radical transparency, where he says to succeed, it's going to require some level of radical transparency. This is someone who's involved in, as a clinician, but also who's involved in the development of some digital phenotyping devices, where he says without transparency, it'll sow doubt and then people will stop using these kinds of devices. But at the same time, and this is where it comes up, these, the large investment of industry in this type of technology is this dichotomy. And so he points out that, there's a need for this investment that goes into this mental health technology in order to cover the costs. And the companies, are needed to invest, but at the same time, they have proprietary information to protect. And, so many times one of the suggestions that came up are, sharing code, sharing the information that goes into these analyses as a part of way of having this transparency. But of course, when dealing with, private industry, there's not as much appetite or desire to do that because of this proprietary information. Not to mention, again, companies have different ethical rules by nature, is what, how this person describes it. And so it creates, interesting tensions in terms of clinical applications. And so these are sort of, as we're going forward, some of the tensions that we're going to be trying to address. With accountability, with this group, there is definitely a desire to pursue self-regulation first. This comes, first of all, from, the concerns about there being that innovation can sometimes be, or there's a concern that innovation can be stifled sometimes by regulation. Not always borne out by empirical research on that. But also, a sort of balance that they're finding of right now, there's a lot of articles and attention coming out about the privacy risks. And so, how to balance the fact that they're at this juncture where there's a lot of concern that people may just become so kind of cynical and concerned about how these devices are using their data that a window closes on being able to use some of these devices clinically for the benefit of people. And so that's where there's been room or some acknowledgement that regulation, maybe along the lines of the GDPR, may be very useful in this context in order to help address some of the consumer concerns that might come up regarding the use of their data, particularly how people may use this data for secondary purposes after it's collected. And informed consent, it kind of just ties up where all of these concerns raised, which ones need to be conveyed through the informed consent process, the extent to which, one person is saying the extent to which people are asked and consented to the use of these devices, that they're told and can understand the implications of generating these data is really important. And so informed consent needs to include this, these information about how the data is going to be used downstream, whether they'll be turned over to consumer companies, pharmaceutical or device companies. Unsurprisingly, it often has been pharmaceutical companies who have expressed a lot of interest in using the digital phenotyping data. And that's, of course, if there is formal consent, as there is in a clinical relationship. As I said, because a number of these are consumer-facing, there's, also just issues of the terms of use. By now, everybody knows, people don't really read the terms of use. I am aware of all these things, and I don't read terms of use the way that I should be. And so, what are the ways, again, sort of going back to the European regulation, where there needs to be, some regulation more of what might need to be closer to informed consent, with people using certain types of websites, but also how you may use the technology itself to improve informed consent. So, the use of sort of staged informed consent, graphics, or other means that might help people better understand just, some of how their data might be used or what might be consented to. Of course, we did have some experts who also, simply, flat out say there may need to be some thought whether some secondary uses, may not be allowable. And finally, children in the space, because there's so much interest in early intervention with mental health, this does raise the question of, children being consented, at least for the sort of clinical purposes of this. As one person pointed out, it's also a trade-off, as in there may be some more concerns about parents consenting for children and being able to sort of account for the different risks some of this data might that might arise with some of the diagnosis, some of the different things that come from the use. But at the same time, they also stand to benefit greatly if there are ways that with certain mental health issues, that it may be used in ways that benefit them to minimize the burden of any potential mental health disorders. And then also within the clinical relationship, there's physician-patient trust. And this is a clinician saying this, what does it mean to you as my patient if I say to you, I want to download this app, let me track what you're doing, how you're behaving 24 hours a day. One can easily imagine that the latent message in that communication is that I don't trust you. I don't believe what you're telling me, and I feel the need to surveil you closely in order to find out what's going on. And so this is an area that I'm also interested in terms of empirical research, is sort of how these types of devices, and many of them are being proposed, whether it's a digital smart pill that tracks compliance with taking medication, to really using the apps to sort of track people and their behavior. This has been a major proposed use of digital mental health technology, and in terms of how people actually perceive, respond to it, that this is a big question in terms of physician-patient trust, and that it may have some negative repercussions for that relationship. And then in general, there is, of course, this need to figure out ways to educate physicians about, both the proper use and implications and limitations of using these kinds of devices, as well as patients. And this is actually a quote from a patient. And what she's saying is that she was actually using one of these digital phenotyping devices. She has bipolar disorder. She's used to monitoring her own behavior. And so she said that she had, taken the data to her physician, and she said, you know what, I don't think that matches what was actually going on with me during that time period. I think that it's really because of the way that I was carrying the device, that, that basically there were these other ways of the way she was using it that was giving incorrect data. And she said that what happened, though, was that the physician was more inclined to believe the device than her. And it actually was a sort of struggle, to get him to actually, after that, listen to what she had to say about it. And it did turn out that it seemed like she had the correct interpretation, that this was actually just a problem in the data collection at that point. So, again, that sort of, how these may be used, or how information then may be needed to give to clinicians, patients, in order educating them about these sort of limitations of this. And so, as you may notice, with the DELPHI study, we really tried to get people from different disciplines as well as different experience with these types of devices. And these things are, this kind of, collaboration and bringing in different disciplines is very important in these kinds of enterprises, for getting the different perspectives, but also for, disseminating that information back. I've heard, from a number of times, I've heard, people in AI saying we actually would benefit for sometimes having some of these more discussions here, but also, where you have a lot of benefit in the different disciplines. from just hearing the expertise from the different areas. And so different stakeholder involvement is very necessary for this, and additional empirical research into, everything from, how people respond to the sort of privacy implications of these kinds of devices and surveillance, to how these get used in practice, in order to see the dimensions of some of these ethical concerns is something that I find important and that I hope to be pursuing in the future. And then I actually do note the article that came out today here, for anyone who's also more interested in this topic. And thank you very much for this chance to tell you about this. Yes.
That was a wonderfully compelling survey. I'm a little surprised that we probably heard parts. Here, Gina, I think it's one of my favorite approaches to genetic information, legal approaches to management. It really says you can't expect people, privacy alone is not enough. You may laugh when you talk about reading and user license. Nobody does. But we need to control the effects of positive for the people who are subjects of it. Mention a little bit about banning certain secondary, but a non-discrimination approach.
Sure. No, I think that's a wonderful question. And that's something that also has been in the back of my mind about this, because, there are some approaches when people talk about privacy, is that at the end of the day, there's maybe not a way to really protect privacy as a certain domain, but what you really want to protect against are these misuses of it. And definitely that's what Gina seeks to do. In the DELPHI panel, I brought this up, particularly to the people of, who have regulatory legal backgrounds, and their response to and their sense of it was, first of all, they felt like Gina, while useful, of course, it's restricted to certain domains of using it, and they were saying that there's consideration of there's so many different types of domains that this can apply to, that it actually may be difficult getting legislation through that would protect all these kind of multiple areas where it might be misused. But I also, and I mean, I still think that this type of approach is really useful to consider, and it's something that I think in the further stages we're going to explore more in the DELPHI study. But I do get a sense, this certainly comes with regulation, and definitely comes with the legislative process, that the legislative process can take so long and can then end up getting watered down, that I think that there was a little bit of a cynical view of going to that area in order to protect against these different misuses. But as I said, I do think that it's an area that is very useful to explore as we go through these different stages of this, in order to get sort of additional views and feedback on how that type of non-discrimination approach might work. Yes.
It was really fascinating, and it's kind of terrifying all in one fell swoop. My sense is that patients or end users may not realize what data is telling about them. Okay, so say I was identified as someone who was suicidal, okay, even though I feel fine, and is that going to affect my life insurance rates? Is that stigma going to carry with me through job interviews, through my career, my all sorts of aspects of my life? What are my rights or ability to be aware of that and to deal with that in some way?
No, again, very good question. It's where, there is, with this study, but also elsewhere, there's a lot of thought to put into, sort of what information, how do you educate people about these potentials. So, as I said, some of it is this sort of different domains. And so, if it's a patient and it's being used for clinical purposes, generally speaking, the data, should be, protected by HIPAA. And where the concern for those kind of implications comes up more with, for example, electronic health records. And, when people sometimes consent to have employers look, that they may not realize that these are downstream implications. And so that's definitely something that there needs to be more awareness of, and more sort of education of people around this. And the consumer domain, I think again, that's where, and this is where my personal view is that, regulation is going to be needed to address this more, as much as certain stakeholders in this would rather go to, sort of other approaches first. But again, the current ways that consumers get informed about these implications obviously are insufficient, as an understatement. And so, there will be a need to educate people both on, secondary uses of the data. Hopefully, with some regulations, give people some more control over secondary uses of their data. But again, more awareness is building right now about, how this data can be used in ways that are really unexpected for people, but there does need to be a lot more effort in that area. I mean, the things that people are able to find just with location data, that comes from the New York Times article, I think, in itself just would surprise a lot of people. And then you put all this other data along with it in terms of what people can, kind of analyze and uncover. I think, definitely a lot of people would not be comfortable about it, and they need to be educated about that. Yes. No, right. So, no, definitely. I mean, difference from genotype is, I mean, I haven't been looking at digital genotype. I mean, my thought is usually when that's used, it actually is just like digital information about one's actual genotype from the genetic information. But I mean, I may be wrong with different uses of it. With digital phenotyping, though, I mean, that's part of the idea is, what this information can tell us. And I think that's what people are trying to be very careful about. I had similar questions too about, how they figure out some of these different things in relation to, what might be kind of cultural, differences of different subpopulations and how they use some of this data. So some of it is, for example, vocal prosody, some of it is they establish a baseline, and then deviations from it are what tell them. So that's not as sort of specific. That's something that can go across different populations, is that it's the deviation from the baseline that is what tells them. So, you might have the use where they establish, certain, or they try to establish certain baselines for your use of it and how it gets calculated. And then it's the deviations from that. If, so you may have very different reaction times in general from somebody else, but what matters is then if day to day, if your reaction times are slowing down or speeding up from your baseline in ways that tell them things that they think tell them things about, sort of your cognition, your mood state. And, that's what it's getting at with certain things of, for example, using this to try and see Parkinson's, someone's Parkinson's trajectory is that it may be there's a certain baseline established, and then when they notice that something is starting to really kind of slow down from that, that gives them, the sort of indicators of that. So, again, of course, as always, there's a need to look at this across different populations to make sure that the things that they're measuring are measuring what they think they're measuring across these different populations. And that's just simply, a huge need and a need for more work to make sure of that. But some of the way that this is done, though, it's not going to, you changing from day to day, it's that what they found out is that things that change within different parameters, and over time from the way that you normally use it are what they then use to sort of try and, analyze the behavior or the cognition. Yeah.
So I remember back in the early days of the human genome, there were just some really fantastical claims made, like, we're going to have pills that are designed for every specific person down to your phenotype. Like, the field made outrageous claims. In some ways, the big data folks have made incredibly outrageous claims about what we can do. And some of that, how much of this is real, that they can actually do what they say, and how much of it is speculating out to the land of fantastic data that we develop, and how much do we worry?
Right. No, I think that's often a concern with this. And I mean, again, I would say, again, with the tech sector involvement and their need to kind of show certain results, have a certain hype, I mean, certainly factors into skepticism about how you evaluate some of these different kinds of claims. So, what I would say is that, some of the claims about sort of really, more fine-grained predictions and how that's going to be used in clinical care, I would say are probably a little farther out, where they're saying that, oh, it's in the next year or so, but they're having, they're definitely running into issues with replicability, validation that, are pushing some of the sort of bigger, more sustained uses of it farther out in time. But, I would also say that, that's the kind of clinical side of it. The side of it where this gets used in various ways on the consumer side, though, and, used to make certain predictions because they don't care as much about the kind of false positives, et cetera. I mean, some of it, as I said, it's already happening sometimes with, how people are assessing, sort of insurance rates. Some of it they're asking you to opt in, like, oh, use our app, and this will give us smart insurance rates. And that's where we also don't know behind the scenes whether they're using it for some, like I said with the Royal Bank of Scotland, where they were also like, oh, hey, it looks like this person actually may have Parkinson's behind the scenes. So those kinds of uses, I think, are already happening. And so that part's not hype, and that's where, if anything, the concerns about kind of misuse, become just starker. But definitely in terms of the clinical side, where they actually care about about validating this, I think they're finding that it's going to be further out than they had initially hoped. And what they might use is just bits and pieces of it, for certain things that they've validated more clearly for certain types of things like depression, and they might use that, but then understanding that there's certain limitations.
We're not only talking about
Mm-hmm.
That's the part, how are clinicians being educated, or is there some,
Right, and I mean, another area that I'm interested in is just more directly sort of use of AI in healthcare, and that's been one of the big conversations right now. There's the question of whether there's just this AI exceptionalism. At the end of the day, they're a different tool, but what's definitely understood is that there really has to be more room made for educating physicians about these limitations, about also, and again, empirical research about finding out in practice practice, are people deciding that they think that this tool is more objective than another physician or their patient, and those are all things that definitely need to be found out in practice in terms of how people actually use these, and how of course I noticed that you say kind of female patient, male doctor, but it's also those kinds of interactions of where there may already be some ways that certain people in the health system are less believed than others. Is this going to, in some ways, right? How is this going to factor in? No, and I think that's very important to consider. Yes. Right. No, definitely. And what you're saying, I mean, these are sort of very important considerations, again, of where that data is going, and that not everyone is aware of that. And I mean, I think that thing with the CPAP and the information going to the insurance came as a surprise to a lot of people. Right. And again, educating people about that. But again, this question of, are there certain uses or certain ways that data flows that needs to be looked at? Right. Exactly. No, definitely. Yes. Oh. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think, as I said, the FDA was understandably kind of taken aback or having trouble grappling with this. This goes the same with privacy, that, the way that privacy had or hadn't, really been protected over the years, that this comes as sort of new terrain about what's possible that people might know about someone individually. I mean, another side to this is, I was talking with, someone who does it as an expert in regulation, is, dividing lines sometimes even of how we think of between these types of practices, and is there a dividing line between what have been sort of accepted as these kind of behavioral marketing practices for a long time, and how those might need to be regulated over time. So I mean, I would actually say that I'm very much in this in the field of, I think that at this point there is so much sort of flow of information that the focus is likely to be best put on potential for misuse, and so I do think that regulations that give both more information, but also more control to consumers about how their data can get used, particularly, the secondary uses down the line. At the end of the day, I actually think that those will be necessary, because I think that, especially with a number of these companies, the pressures that come from business models, and, how are they going to, make money providing, or make way more money providing certain services, that the pressures from that, that you end up most likely needing a regulation that will just simply shift at least some more control back to consumers. And did you have, or is this okay?
So we have her scheduled like every half hour. So we've got to wrap up now. I took a bunch of notes so that I can send you questions later.
Okay, but thank you very much for the chance to share this. Oh, great.
Great job.
Oh, thank you.